And Professor McCloskey, it's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to not so much to debate, but to talk about the ideas you espouse in your book, Why Liberalism Works.
Yeah.
And probably the first question that I need to put to you is you make it clear in the preface to your book that by liberalism you mean Adam Smith's liberalism, what we Europeans would tend to think of liberalism, not U.S. liberalism. Probably
yes.
That's the first issue for you to address.
Yes, that's certainly true. It's strange how the word changed. It started changing in the 1880s in Britain, where they spoke of the new liberalism, which turned out to be heavy regulation by the state and so on. So the opposite of Adam Smith. I always cross myself when as I say Adam Smith. He's a saint. So yes, and then by 1933 or so, liberalism in the United States had come to mean moderate democratic socialism, which is not liberalism.
So we are going to talk here about essentially liberalism in Adam Smith's sense. And in that connection, I would like to emphasize and for you to elaborate on several concepts which repeatedly throughout your book you mentioned. The first one is the concept of the great enrichment, which took place in Europe in the 19th century and more recently in India and China. Also, your idea that you don't like at all the term capitalism, and you rather replace it by innovism. In Spanish, innovismo, as the translator have rightly said. Could you explain to us a bit more?
Well, it is, in order to get away from the ancient idea of a zero-sum economy, in which I, as an aristocrat, become rich by taking from you as a peasant, right? In order to get away from that, I think it's important for people to understand how amazingly large the increase in income per head has been since Adam Smith's time. Now, it's hard to believe this figure, but if you think about it slowly and carefully and start thinking of examples of it, it comes out to be about right. Your ancestors and mine, or to express it the other way, we, compared with our ancestors, are, hear this, 3,000% better off in material terms. What? 3,000%? A factor of 30? Huh? How can that be? I mean, people think of, well, maybe since 1800, there's, I don't know, been an increase of 100%, which would be a doubling, or even 200%, a tripling. And they say, well, most of it goes to the rich people. That's not true. It's a factor of 30. And it's mainly gone, so far as the standard of comfort is concerned, to poor people, like your ancestors and mine. So I call it the Great Enrichment. It's not the classic Industrial Revolution, which is a century-long episode between, say, 1750 and 1850, but it's the amazing increase since then. And all you have to do is kind of look around your room. I mean, here's a crazy example. Behind me, in my apartment building is held up with reinforced concrete. That's what this is. It was invented by the owner of a big French garden in the 1850s, who thought, well, let's take this ancient technology of cement, right, or concrete, and add steel. They had just invented cheap steel, so add steel, and sure enough, you can hold up enormous buildings with this stuff. Okay. Multiply that by, I don't know, 10,000 times, and you've got the great enrichment. So now, the problem with capitalism, the word capitalism, is that it suggests that the motive, what's making this happen, is capital accumulation. Everyone believes this. The pro-capitalists and the anti-capitalists both believe that accumulation, piling up reinforced concrete buildings, is what has made us rich. And that's wrong. At least for cause, it's wrong, causally. Of course, to have an advance, you've got to do it, right? You think of reinforced concrete, then you have to actually do it. And that's capital accumulation. But you need a labor force, you need a climate, you need sunshine. There are infinite number of necessary conditions. But the sufficient condition was innovation, new ideas. And that's why I prefer to call what we usually call capitalism innovism, because that's its heart. And to talk about capitalism is to take our attention away from the conditions of innovation, among which are a free society.
Yeah. And this brings us to another concept, interesting concept that you mentioned in this book and in your previous book, about what you call the bourgeois deal. So this idea that the bourgeois invent, but then they don't reap at all 100% of the benefits from their invention, because imitators come on stream, and then and you mentioned also again the Schumpeterian idea of creative destruction as another powerful consequence of this innovism.
Yeah, it was actually Zombart, not Schumpeter, who invented the phrase, the great German sociologist and economic historian Zombart. But it became famous through Schumpeter. And exactly as you say, what we mean by creative destruction is not a bunch of people with swords going around killing people. We mean people thinking up new ideas. Reinforced concrete becomes a substitute for structural steel. You know, you can use I-beams, so-called in English, and build a building, or you can use structural concrete. Either way, and then that, as you said, that gives the gains, the social gains, to you and me, because structural concrete and I-beams, steel I-beams, or bricks for that matter, are competing with each other. So again, it's a matter of getting beyond zero sum. Because in zero sum, if an inventor invents something, she keeps it, right? She keeps the game. But that's not really how it works. She, as you said, she gets imitated. A classic example is the invention of the department store, which spread all over the world, especially in France and Britain, the United States, eventually Spain, and was a very successful innovation. And small fortunes all over Spain and the United States were made by owning and starting a department store in the late 19th century or the early 20th century. But eventually people, you know, so many department stores existed that the original idea, which was brilliant, Bon Marché in Paris, or Marshall Fields in Chicago. This was such a brilliant idea that everyone adopted it, and then it became routine, and you and I got the benefit.
At the same time, don't you think that these days, in some industries, the existence of network externalities, the fact that some products are more useful, more people use them, entrench some suppliers.
Yeah, I understand that, and we're on Zoom right now. which is an example of a network externality. So is the phone system 100 years ago. And we assumed 100 years ago that because there were network externalities, the telephone system needed to be owned by the state, right? And you may recall that that didn't work out very well. You know, yes, there might be externalities, network externalities and others, but you can't just immediately assume that the government will do a better job. And in many countries, the government did a terrible job with the new telephone system. It took years to get a new telephone in most countries. Whereas then we invented a substitute, which was the cell phones, and suddenly we had entry and competition. Yeah, I think that Google and Facebook and now Zoom have network externalities. But again, that doesn't necessarily imply that there's some emergency problem. Zoom is successful because it works. The other systems don't work very well. And eventually, not too long from now, someone will invent a substitute for Zoom. It's happened over and over again in this innovism.
In the case you make for free markets and innovation, something which is striking in your book is that you describe the market as the great liberator of minorities and disadvantaged group, including poor people, women, and the like. And you call for free immigration, if
much so.
You correctly. Could you elaborate a bit?
Well, here's the basic core economic idea of liberalism. You and me should be allowed to make a deal, a trade, with anyone we want. Now look, if the deal is that you kill my husband, then the state has an interest in preventing that, and I understand that. So as long as it's legal, and then we've got to be careful about making too many things against the law. As long as it's legal, you should be able to trade. Now, why would that right stop at the Spanish border? Why would it not be legal for Spaniards to trade freely with Moroccans, as in fact they once did? You know, there's no principled objection as long as the idea has no interest in intervening in your harmless trades. So that's the case for free trade, but the case for free immigration is exactly the same, because either you can trade with George in the United States in the goods market, you know, or you can bring George to Spain, allow him to come to Spain and make whatever he does, do whatever he does there. And so it's this, I don't want to emphasize the free migration too much because it frightens people. And then they get unhappy about it. I don't insist on it. Even if inside a country there was free trade, I'd be happy.
Well, I see. One of the funniest thing in your book is that you not only make a case for liberalism, but you also criticize strongly and lash out at what you call the leftist clerisy, in Spanish, clerecía, and the what you describe as the slow socialists and the like. But at the same time, you mentioned that the fact that we grow up in families which are essentially socialist communities make us with a natural inclination towards socialism. Yeah,
that's right. I think that's true. This hypothesis is easily testable. You could actually, sociologically, you could go out and find whether this is true or not, but I think modern children who grow up in a rich society like Spain or the United States often don't know what their father does at the office, whatever that is. And they don't, their ancestors worked when they were 14 years old. Most children, by law, most children do not work now. And so they don't grasp the economy easily. It's my experience as a teacher that my students who grew up on farms, say in Iowa, the state of Iowa, or grew up in a small business where they worked a little bit as children, understood economics very easily. They understood scarcity and the market and blah, blah, blah. And that's always going to be a problem because, as you said, the family must be a socialist enterprise. From each according to her abilities, to each according to his need. I mean, you wouldn't charge your children for lunch, make them work 10 hours a day to buy lunch. You can't do that. In fact, I was once a socialist, it's worth pointing out. So it's not as if I don't understand the attractions of socialism, but I grew up as the child of a Harvard professor, and I had no idea how the economy worked. And of course, very naturally, you end up with this zero-sum idea that, for example, that one theory that a lot of people have on both the left and right, especially on the left, is that the bosses have piles of gold in the back room. And the purpose is to struggle against the bosses and make them give some of the gold or all of it to us, to the poor people. And, the problem is that the bosses get their gold by selling stuff to us that pleases us. So there's a great fallacy here that you can demand, 6-week vacations and higher minimum wage and blah, 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 endlessly. So I don't know, yeah. I'm not just a liberal, I'm a Christian liberal. I believe we have an obligation to the poor. But my friends on the left and my friends on the right, I have friends in both camps, don't seem to understand that the real help to the poor came from comparatively, historically, leaving people alone to innovate.
Yeah. No, I quite agree with you with the idea that even though we grew up in socialist communities, families, then the nation, as you say, the nation is not a family. This Hayekian idea that when you grow big, you need to organize. But let me point out to something which I see some minor contradiction in your book, because later on, when you talk about savings and fiscal policy, you quote Adam Smith again, and this famous sentence that what is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarcely be folly in that of a great kingdom, which I understood as you arguing against anti-cyclical fiscal policy and making a comparison between families and nations. So I see a bit of contradiction here.
Well, I'm not sure it's quite a contradiction because the family argument is a psychological hypothesis. Why we're always and increasingly going to have to argue against our children who say naively, let's try socialism, as though socialism was never tried in Cuba or in the Soviet Union or in Venezuela. Okay, so that's the psychological, but the modeling point that Smith is making is that a nation can be viewed as a family analytically, not as a psychological hypothesis, but analytically. And there I think he's correct. I think that just as you and I should be able to trade freely, if we don't do, we shouldn't be able to trade in slaves or something, but we should be able to trade in books or whatever. So too, nations should be able to trade with each other freely. So I think I don't think it's exactly a contradiction. I see what you mean. It sounds like a contradiction, but I don't think it is very, very much.
Because you express critical views about Keynesian ideas of expanding fiscal deficits and the like at a time when people insist on saving. And I'm very much fond of Keynes. So I was somewhat disappointed by your criticism of Keynesian ideas, which after all are based on the idea that nations are not families, and sometimes the government should do counterintuitive things, which as an individual you shouldn't do.
Well, I've been ever, except a European-style conservative. That I've never been. But I've been an anarchist. Prince Kropotkin of Russia was my hero for a while. Then a Marxist, kind of. I was not very scholarly, but I was a Marxist. Then when I started studying economics at Harvard College, I became a Keynesian, because that's, in the early 1960s, that's what was on offer. But I never quite believed it. It always seemed, I wasn't really intelligent about it. It's just that it seemed a little strange that you get rich by spending more. But it didn't seem to have common sense attached to it. And I have since then developed a more, as many economists have, a more sophisticated understanding of what's wrong with Keynesian economics. Actually, I just wrote a book with Deirdre N called The Myth. The Myth of the Entrepreneurial State, which is directed chiefly at Mariano Mazzucato, who's a well-known American, British, Italian figure these days. And her master is Keynes. Keynes wrote in 1936, I don't have the exact quotation to him, but he said, and this is crazy, he said, we economists are in a position to calculate the marginal efficiency of investment, by which he meant what investments were a good idea, on longer perspectives than the market does with wisdom. And when you think about that, that's slightly crazy. That some bureaucrat or economist, fancy economist in Madrid or Washington knows how to invest in my neighborhood. Strikes, as Hayek said, there's local knowledge involved in all investment. That's just crucially important.
Yeah. Well, but probably you need to distinguish between the micro and the macro aspects, and you may be a free market advocate in micro things, whereas on some special circumstances, like is the case now, there is a case for deficits to grow just to sustain global demand. But anyway,
I don't think so. I don't actually think so. But those details about macro policy, I long ago stopped paying attention to macroeconomics because it kept changing. Every 5 years, there's a new. Now there's these complete lunatics called, what are they called? The new monetary economists, who say the deficits don't matter, print all the money you want. That's how to do it. And it's complete craziness, in my opinion.
By the way, in this connection, to the extent that your thinking is pretty close to Hayek and
Yeah,
to the Austrian, would you favor, as Hayek did, the denationalization of money
yeah,
and the creation of private currencies like, say, Libra, Facebook's Libra?
yeah,
I
absolutely,
think that's wrong, but do you are in
absolutely, absolutely. Look, there's an interesting fact here. Milton Friedman, my colleague at the University of Chicago, believed in the nationalization of money, high-powered money. He believed there should be a state role in controlling the money supply. His son, David, who was a longtime friend of mine, and we were at Harvard College at about the same time and then in Harvard Graduate School, but he was in physics. I was merely in economics. David and I don't believe that. We think that money should be anything people want. They can make cowrie shells money or gold money or do whatever they want. And I see no role for a central bank. I think the central bank should be closed. I think people should, that those economists who work at them should go do something useful, etc.
And then you would be happy for Libra to operate a parallel currency in the US and people being able to switch from dollars to Libra, from euros to Libra.
Say, if a long time ago, someone gave a speech like this at the University of Chicago and said, we ought to have a currency system that has a bundle of goods in it, right? And we should aim to stabilize that. And this was when I was an assistant professor. And I got up in the middle of being not a macroeconomist and very confused. I said, but how do you get people to hold it? And that's the problem. My macroeconomist colleagues came over and said, that's a good comment. I said, yeah, damn right it is. if we're going to go away from the dollar standard, which is the one we in effect have now, people have to want to hold whatever it is you're talking about, whether it's gold or Libra or whatever. And well, again, it goes back to this kind of voluntaristic principle. I like to call liberalism adultism. It's the theory of a society of free adults. Whereas all other philosophies, political philosophies, and their corresponding economic philosophies are for children. To treat people like children, like people need to be supervised or whatever. So liberalism is adultism.
Yes, that's true. But something which I miss in your book is some reference to game theory and prisoners' dilemmas, because we are all adults, but we interact with each other, and sometimes we may be tempted to act in an uncooperative way because we can trust the others. So there is sometimes a significant case for a collective action.
But again, the implicit assumption in that kind of analysis, which is very common in economics, is that the collective actors, whoever they are, will do a better job than the people on the scene. And here I follow, what's her name? Esther, the winner of the Nobel Prize in 2008.
Jean Tirole or Kahneman? Daniel?
No, a woman. Esther, is that her?
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway, she says in a very sort of womanly way, quite sensible actually, guys, if you have a problem of, say, the aquifer under Los Angeles that's starting to decline, if it declines too much, salt water comes in from the sea and wrecks the aquifer entirely. Maybe you can do it, and she studied this very carefully, by talking. Maybe you can solve the obvious prisoner's dilemma problem or the common pool problem by negotiation, by talking. you may not have to have the transcendent power of the state. And in any case, however it works out, in a way, we have to be realistic about human capacities. People in Madrid are not all wise. I think we all agree on that. And to say, well, there are externalities, here, think of it this way. The way you and I were taught economics, we spent a week on supply and demand curves and perfect competition. And then the rest of the microeconomics course was devoted to showing that that didn't work. And their only evidence for it, I was a student of Edward Chamberlain at Harvard, the inventor of monopolistic competition. And that's exactly how our course went. 1 week on supply and demand, and for the rest showing, oh no, that's stupid, it doesn't work. Well, except that Chamberlain and no one else has any evidence of this. They just say, oh, it doesn't work, doesn't work. Look, their evidence is on the blackboard or in the math. And I'm not against blackboards or mathematics, but you got to have factual information showing it's a danger. Let's go back to the example you gave a few minutes ago. Network externalities. I don't deny they exist, but exist is a mathematical concept, not an engineering concept. And what we need is how big. We need to get away from this idea that you can solve great social questions on a blackboard or in a lecture. You've got to have facts.
Yeah. One of the ideas you explain in your book at length, with which I agree 100%, is that we should worry about poverty, not inequality.
That's right.
That's very right. But could you explain it?
Well, your ancestors and mine were unspeakably poor. In Spain or the United States in 1800, income per head was on the order of $2 a day to maybe $6 a day, period. Now in the United States, in the same prices, to the extent you can adjust for them, it's $130 a day that people earn and make and spend. And in Spain, it's about $100 a day. This is an amazing change. And it's that, they say on the left, they're scornful of this liberal assertion that all boats rise as the sea rises. But, and I can see being kind of skeptical of it if they only rise a little bit. And you say, well, what's the big deal? But no, they're not rising a little bit. They're going they're by 3,000%. And that's, look, I don't care how many chateau or diamond bracelets Liliane Bettencourt, the heiress to the L'Oreal cosmetics fortune, had. I think she's dead now. It doesn't bother me. Okay, she spent stupidly on a 7th chateau. Okay, what a dumb thing to do. But I'm okay. I'm doing pretty well. And the poorest people in our societies are doing so much better than they did under the old regime that we should stop worrying about this. I mean, look, there are 2 problems in the world: tyranny and poverty. Those are the real problems we face. If we solve those, if we get rid of the tyrants like Putin and so forth, that'll solve the poverty problem, because without tyrants, people will innovate. And Xi is another stupid tyrant. And then we can solve the environmental problem, the problem of handicapped people, the problem of people who are poor because their parents were poor. We can solve those problems easily out of a 3,000% increase.
I fully agree with you, but probably because we, both of us, are enlightened liberals. And
Yes.
you in your book criticize Robert Frank, who insists that we care about relative position about with respect to others, and that's probably why people are so interested not only in poverty but also in limiting equality. And in another topic that you rightly mentioned is the what you describe as the nonsense of competitiveness, meaning
Yeah.
that we should worry about the US or Europe losing
Yeah.
ground to the others.
Yeah. Well, on the competitiveness point, to put it in technical terms, what many people, not Bob Frank is a very good economist, but Bob, what's his name? The guy from Berkeley, um, and Neil Ferguson and lots of others, historians mainly. They worry about competitiveness, and what they're doing is confusing absolute advantage with comparative advantage. Of course, it's desirable that, I don't know, the Spanish railway system be improved, although I think you over-improved it with too many high-speed rail. But it's not, comparative advantage has nothing to do with absolute advantage. And I don't need to go into the details. But the problem with Robert Frank, the great economist at Cornell, problem with his notion of relative, our anxieties about the neighbors, keeping up with the Joneses, we say in English, is that it's silly. It's not true. I look around my room, and you can do the same, and say, I have 8,000 books. Do I have 8,000 books because that allows me to brag to other scholars that I own more books than they do? Umberto Eco, the late Italian intellectual, had a personal library of 30,000 books. And the naive journalist would say, have you read all these? He said, no. But it's the next book I read that might be the important one. And that's my attitude towards having 8,000 books. It's got nothing to do with how many books other scholars own. I don't care. If I could get along on, 30 books, I would. Again, so it's a kind of a silly hypothesis, and encourages envy. What Bob Frank does is, what can you say? He honors envy as a purpose of social policy. And the trouble with envy, as Shakespeare said in a famous sonnet, is that it's insatiable. It can never be satisfied. Some women are more beautiful than I am. I mean, not too many, but some are. You're smarter than I am. You speak both Spanish and English. By the way, I'm trying to learn Spanish, but very slowly. I could go on envying people endlessly. And then how do I make you as stupid as I am? Let's have equality of IQ, of intelligence. Well, I know how to do it. Pound nails into your head until you are as stupid as I am. I mean, this is loco. This is insane. The smart, let's not indulge envy, which is a mortal sin.
You're unfair with Frank and with all behavioral economists, because you are yourself a very rational liberal. But the point they make, behavioral economists, including Daniel Kahneman and the like, is that we have biases and we care about our relative position in the pecking order. So that's the fact of life. That's psychology.
No, I don't accept their evidence. Kahneman, as you know, although he got the Nobel Prize in economics, is nothing like an economist. Bob Frank should know better. But you know, as well as I do, that individual psychology is not the point of economics. The point of economics is how people interact. And they can be ignorant and make lots of mistakes and still achieve reasonable efficiency or innovism, right? If they have the right ideas, they roughly right ideas.
Yeah.
They don't have to be geniuses. Whereas I mean, I've had discussions, some of them quite angry, with behavioral economists. And I keep saying to them, so you're saying that if consumers are irrational, then the state should come in and fix it. And we're back to this problem that the state is not perfect. The guy who won, Bob Thaler, or Thaler as they say in German, Thaler, got the Nobel Prize, and I didn't know anything about his work, but I was asked to write a little article about it. So I read some of it, and I was really startled because he starts out, now hear the number, with the 240 cognitive biases that psychologists have discovered. Hear the number, 240. It's incredible that we can get across the room without killing ourselves. But okay, 240 biases. And he says, look, people are nuts. They're crazy. Look, they have 240 biases. And then he says, the market can't help them. You can't, for example, have a fancy department store that guarantees its goods and will give you a money bank guarantee. That's impossible. There's no solution to these biases, which is crazy. And then he says, therefore, the government should intervene and boss people around, nudge people, as he says. Well, I don't think there are three steps in that argument, all of which are wrong empirically. And in any case, we're social scientists, we economists. We don't need to redo individual psychology. By the way, my sister is an academic psychologist, and she and her friends who do these experiments say that the economists are very bad at the experiments. They don't know how to do them right. So they're going to get even the redoing of individual psychology wrong, but individual psychology is not social science.
Yeah. But let me give you an example of a nudge, of those nudges you dislike. And this one was in years ago proposed by Richard Taylor himself, and now is very timely in Spain because it might be used by one of our ministers for pension funds, which is the idea, is the Save More Tomorrow scheme, under which in companies, workers are assumed to join automatically pension plans, except if they opt out. And in that sense, they are not, to use your term, push around, because they preserve the freedom to opt out. But defaults are powerful in human psychology. And as has been seen in the UK, by using this Save More Tomorrow, you can get workers to save more.
Yeah, that's right. Well, as I had a discussion with Bob Frank, who's a good guy and a very good economist, once about this, and he said, Deirdre, you ought to approve of this nudging because it's paternalistic libertarianism. And I said, Bob, what does that mean? It's a contradiction in terms. Either you're paternalistic or you treat people like adults. And ask yourself, is a government that's skilled enough and honest enough and disinterested enough to do correct nudges, powerful enough also to run a tyranny? And the answer is yes. If you want, it's like the old story of the frog in the boiling water. You just gradually raise the temperature, and the frog says, oh, this is kind of nice. Oh, this is kind of nice. And eventually the frog boils at 100 degrees. That's what you're giving the government.
Yes.
And I don't think governments are good at that. They've shown, yeah, I'm an economic historian by scientific field, and I see them doing remarkably stupid things all the time. Now private businesses do stupid things too, but then they go out of business.
Mm.
Whereas the government keeps wanting to say draft people instead of paying them. And it just keeps doing it.
Yeah, actually, you argue in one of the chapter 10 that honest and competent governments are rare, which, but you go as high as 90%. 90% of governments
Yeah.
are corrupt or inept or whatever. And probably the percentage should be lower than 90%, don't you think?
Well, yeah, I think so too. And actually, in the first version of that calculation, Spain was the cutoff. Now it's Portugal, and Spain is adequately, honest. But Italy, a country I know and love, is down around Saudi Arabia and Vietnam, or not Azerbaijan. And any Italian knows that that Lo Stato is incompetent and corrupt. And yet, there are very few Italian liberals. I don't understand it. No sentient Italian believes in the state, and yet they keep expanding it.
As you said before, you espouse humane liberalism.
Yes.
And actually, you make two claims which I found very, very interesting. First, you argue for a minimum income and against a minimum wage. That distinction is very interesting. Yeah. And you also say that we should raise property taxes and reintroduce in the States inheritance taxes, which I found remarkable.
But look, I'm not for rich people. I'm not for rich people. That's kind of the claim that our friends on the left and the right make about us liberals, who are actually not even on their scale. We're up somewhere above it. But anyway, I'm not for rich people. I want poor people to be better off. And one way to make them better off is to focus taxes on resources, to use the technical economics, that are inelastically supplied. If you have an income tax, people have an incentive to avoid it by changing the source of their income, or so it fits the code better, or not working or something. Whereas if you impose it on property and even on inheritance, it's long been understood in economics, and there's a great deal of empirical support for it, that the incentive effects, the messing with the economy is held to a minimum. This was the conviction of the first great American economist, Henry George, back 150 years ago. And it's Ricardo too, that you can tax the landlords with that, because land can't move. So you tax it. But that's, of course, what irritates people. So you get all these movements to abolish the property tax, but that means you have to put it on beer or income, or you have to put it somewhere. The worst of these taxes is the corporate income tax, which is an extremely bad tax, which actually my friend Alito Harberger claims that it falls on the workers.
Yeah, but that's, I agree with you that property taxes and inheritance taxes are fine, and the tax base is really cannot move, and they are effective. But in Spain, for a liberal, that's quite unusual to.
Well, that's because in the Hispanic world, I've noticed, and you can tell me more about it than I understand. The word liberal Oh, in Latin America, being a liberal often means supporting a terrible oligarchy of monopolistic corporations and protecting them. And when the workers complain, breaking the strike with bringing in the army. I mean, this is not liberal.
Yeah.
So I'm, as I said, I'm not a European conservative.
Yes. Well, actually, you make a very interesting claim, which is that government protection mostly harm the poor, which is a very powerful view and has many consequences. By the way, I would recommend readers, and I myself having made a note of reading chapter 12 of the I Promessi Sposi of Alessandro McCloskey, the betrothed of Novios.
I had to read it in English, alas, but chapter 12 of I Promessi Sposi is a lesson in economics that everyone ought to read. And it says the government should not intervene in a famine. Now, this sounds crazy. Come on, the government's got to intervene. It's got to prevent those prices from going up and what's the word that people often use? Anyway, you mustn't allow the merchants of grain to make a fortune on this. But if you don't, you won't get new supplies of grain.
And one of the interventions you disagree with is against the traffic on drugs. You literally write, true liberals oppose the war on drugs.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and I like the way they've done it in Portugal, where they, as I understand it, I'm not expert on it, but they've decriminalized practically everything. And the result has been that the number of drug addicts has not changed, but the number of criminals who are able to make a good living out of killing other criminals in the drug trade has fallen. Now, I think that, as I said before, if you're going to allow free exchange, you got to stop, how can I say this, not approving of other people's consumption. One of the things I don't like about my friends on the left, and especially on the right, is their disdain, their kind of sneering, their disdainful attitude towards the consumption of other people. You know, if you want to eat Fritos and watch daytime TV all day, that's your choice. I'd rather you didn't. I'd rather you listen to Beethoven and wrote books about liberalism all day long. But that's okay.
Let me, as we have only 10 minutes left by my counting, let me put you on the spot with issues which are very relevant these days. One is the COVID pandemic. And with respect to COVID, I would like to put to you 3 questions. First one is, were you against mandatory lockdowns to the extent that they could be seen as pushing people around? Then
no, I was not.
No.
No,
So
I think that any rational liberal, now I have some libertarian friends who are not entirely rational about this, in my opinion. But anyway, a rational liberal, look, if Spain is invaded by France, you don't wait until they've conquered Catalonia and then say, well, maybe we ought to get together and resist the French invasion. Well, they've gotten to Madrid, maybe you should wait until they get to somewhere else. No. As soon as they cross the border, if they can, considering the way you've changed the railways, stop them, right? A forest fire is the same way. If you wait until the forest fire is gigantic, then you're in real trouble. But if you jump on it, so my view early in the COVID epidemic was to do exactly what, very interestingly, the Western Pacific nations did. From New Zealand to South Korea, they jumped on it. They moved in quickly originally, suppressed it with a lockdown, to the point at which if you look at the charts, it's quite extraordinary. Spain, France, and the United States are way up here, Italy, and these Western Pacific nations are down here with hardly any deaths and so on and so forth. That's the right way to do it.
Yeah, and once the vaccine is widely available, in your view, could mandatory vaccination be required, or could people not vaccinated be subject to particular restrictions?
Well, here it depends on the R, the intrinsic R of, as you know, the reproduction rate of the disease. The R for measles is about 16. Without vaccination or anything, one measles case infects 16 other people. Whereas the R for this novel coronavirus is at most about 2. That's bad enough, but it's only 2. In that case, so we have compulsory vaccination for measles. And as a liberal, I'm perfectly willing to send in the police into someone's house and forcefully vaccinate their children. Or you can do it in a more gentle way. You can say, you can't let your child into school until she's certified to have had a vaccine, a measles vaccine. But I don't think we'll need to do it with this particular one.
Yeah. Let me talk also about climate change and the Paris Accord. And 2 questions. First, do you think that climate change is something which requires collective action or could be solved in the future by some technology? And in case there is a need for collective action, to what extent the US should go back to the Paris Accord under Joe Biden?
Well, I want us to go back to the Paris Accord. I certainly do. Paris Accord is just an accord. It hasn't, and it's international, so it hasn't got any, there's no policeman waiting to make France or the United States or Spain do what they promised to do. But on the other hand, I think from a moral point of view, it's highly desirable. I think global warming, which I worry about, is caused by human intervention. Wait a second, I have to answer this damn phone. Oh God, I wish people would leave me alone. And I think that there's case for government action, as for example, Margaret Thatcher's support for the ban on hairspray, and then eventually air conditioning fluid that was causing a hole in the ozone layer. As a chemist, she believed it, and as a big user of hairspray, she knew that we could get rid of this. So there's even a free market liberal. She was more conservative than liberal, but anyway, free market liberal in favor of government intervention. But the question of kind of, you can have a deep central plan, what to do in this part of the economy or that. Or you can have a light intervention such as a carbon tax, which I'm in favor of, which will, I hate to use the word, but nudge people towards doing something about it. But my basic optimism about this is that we are developing technologies that can solve it. I go with this character, Landborg, the engineer from Denmark, who says, yes, global warming is caused by carbon, but let's try to think of ways that take care of it, that don't involve, destroying Western civilization. This silly schoolgirl from Sweden who rode across the Atlantic and became people's guide. I mean, for God's sakes, a Swedish high school student is taken as the last word on what to do. And what she wants to do, and many of the people on the left do, is close down Western civilization. Well, that's nuts. That's terrible for poor people. Yeah. So I'm very emphatic about this. I want us to do it rational, sensible.
Let me mention my last question, because we don't have much more time, is about relations between the US and China, and particularly Huawei. What do you think the approach taken by the Trump administration towards Huawei, of crippling the business of Huawei, has been the right one, or a liberal policy should allow all competitors to do as they wish without any restrictions?
Nothing the Trump administration did, except a little bit of deregulation, was good. It was all tending in a fascist direction. Spanish people know what fascism means, and that's what Donald Trump is and wants to be. So no, I think it was very foolish. I think the fear about China is also foolish. I think that China's adventures in the South China Sea, we should oppose with military force, with the Navy. I think Xi Jinping's constant threat to invade Taiwan should, we should stop that right away and say, you do that, we're going to bomb you. We should be concerned about the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and the Hong Kongers, and we should, I don't mind if we would stop trade with China entirely on account of these shocking abuses of human rights. I believe in liberty, and I believe it for it in China too, a country that I know a little bit about. But this idea that China's rise is cause the decline of the West is more of this zero-sum thinking. It's the idea that if China gets better off, we're worse off. Now, how exactly are we worse off if they're sending us television sets or whatever? By the way, there's a racist component to it, which I object to very much. You remember, you're old enough to remember, in the 1880s, the fear about Japan on exactly the same grounds. Now that's funny. If the Dutch or the Spaniards were successful in this way, no one would pay any attention to this. Oh, that's great. We get to trade with the Dutch and the Spaniards. But if it's people from East Asia, we say, the East Asian hordes are coming. Oh, that's terrible. And I think that's just awful. I don't think China is a big economic threat. If China wants to invest in stupid things, like high-speed rail, it's done the same thing that Spain did on a much bigger scale. High-speed rail all over the country, which is loony for a poor country like that. Or if it wants to invest in the Belt and Road Initiative, do a railway across Central Asia, which is, from the economic point of view, equally stupid. If they want to invest in Africa, go ahead. Because the first time an African government doesn't like paying interest or profits to the Chinese, it can say, so sorry, this is our railway now.
Yeah.
Go away, va-via, you Chinese. And the Chinese will be able to do nothing about it. So there's no threat from China from that point of view.
Something which struck me is a sentence by the former honorary chairman of Huawei, Mr. Ren, that said that the reason why Huawei is so far ahead of its competitors is that it's not a listed company, and that allowed the company to invest much more in research and development, whereas its competitors, Ericsson, Nokia, and the like, were forced by short-term capital markets to pay attention to dividends and the like. So it struck me because I am a former chairman of the Spain Securities Commission. And I'm thinking that being non-listed is an advantage vis-a-vis.
Well, like you and I probably agree on this. Sometimes it's an advantage, sometimes it's not an advantage. My friend and colleague Ronald Coase, the great Nobel Army economist, made this point. But sometimes it's an advantage to put your whatever it is, your supply of steel or your common stocks out in the marketplace, and sometimes it's an advantage to hold them closely. It as Ronald kept saying, and no one really got it. He kept saying it depends, and George Stigler said, "No, it doesn't depend. Capitalism always works perfectly." And Ronald said, "Well, I don't know."
Well, unfortunately, Professor McCloskey, we don't have much time. I really enjoy reading your book, and I have enjoyed even more just talking to you. And what probably is more important, when I read your book, I thought, well, I agree 80% with Professor McCloskey. Now I think we agree on probably 95%.
Yes, that's all I need.
There are a few issues, Natchez, Libra, and prisoners' dilemmas and the like, but I think your book is very welcome, particularly in Spain, because there are very few true liberals in Spain, and sometimes the few which exist are against inheritance taxes and property taxes and immigration. So they need also themselves to read your book.
It's strange because Spain famously has a great anarchist tradition. And, the anarchists, some of them at least, believe in markets.